I'm not sure about the intellectual bit, neither the humorous bit, but I'll try. Ladies and gentlemen, seniors and youngsters,
and pagols,
and the three loonies as well. I'm going to talk to you about a subject which may ring a bell with some of you. The topic, a question of identity, is best presented or introduced in the form of another question. A question that most of you would have been asked at some point, at some place. And the question is, where are you from? Now, fair enough. Using an Australian colloquialism, it's a fair dinkum question. Because more often than not, it is a harmless, benign question. Sometimes just a conversation starter. But sometimes, beneath that question, there's a nuanced subtext which can be both unsettling and confronting. But as for me, I usually answer the question honestly and directly, which either validates whatever preconception the questioner might have about where I come from, or at the very least, it confirms that I'm not a son of the soil, so to speak. But sometimes my answer is quite devious without being incorrect. I say, why? I'm from Glen Waverley. And before the questioner can recover from my cheeky answer, I take him on a voyage of my global odyssey, all the continents and countries that I have lived in. Saudi Arabia, Oman, Brazil, Canada. And finally, I tell him what he really wants to know, the name of my birth country, Bangladesh, where I've lived the first 24 years of my life. So sometimes I too ask myself the same question, where am I from? And what does it really mean after all these years? Sometimes on a sleepless night, I do play a DVD of my life in fast forward mode. And what I see are images from my childhood in Bangladesh in a village, walking to school past lush green rice fields, juxtaposed with images of pristine, clear white snow from Canada, mixed with the sound of the samba from a carnival in Rio de Janeiro, with images of gleaming brown sand dunes in Arabia in the background, and in the foreground, a triumphant Kathy Freeman taking a victory lap after she won the 400-meter Olympics. And what unfolds is a kaleidoscopic tapestry of my life, in which my sense of identity is totally diffused and dispersed and blurred. So when I ask myself, who am I and what am I? Am I just a member of the extended Bangladeshi diaspora who just happens to have an Australian passport of convenience? Or am I an Australian who happens to have Bangladeshi roots, much like Barack Obama is an American with Kenyan roots? And of course the comparison stops there. And that dichotomy exists in my mind, as it does in the minds of those who ask me the question, where are you from? But more and more, for most of us, home has less to do with a piece of the soil, rather than what you might say with a piece of the soul. And I always strongly believed in that, but it really came home to me so to speak, many years back when I was living in Muscat, Oman. The occasion was a dinner party in my house back in 1996. And after dinner, we had all gathered around the TV, waiting for Mr. Anthony Samaranch, who was the then president of the International Olympic Committee. And he was going to announce which city was going to win the right to host the 2000 Olympics. Now, the gathering in the room amongst my guests was indisputably pro-Beijing. Beijing was one of the contenders. For one reason or another, everyone was supporting Beijing. And therefore, I was quiet and subdued, expecting the very worst, that Australia would lose yet again after the debacle of Melbourne 4 years ago, when it lost to Atlanta. So I kept quiet until Samaranch announced Sydney. And for a few seconds, there was a hushed silence in the room, a silence of disappointment, until I suddenly let go of a primeval scream, "Yes, Sydney!" with an intensity that was 1,000 decibels, which reverberated through the room. And it absolutely stunned and astonished my guests. And I too was a little embarrassed at this childish outburst. But precisely then I realized that I too had become an Australian, and I had acquired an Australian identity to add to the portfolio of the many other identities that I have. I might not have been standing on Australian soil on that evening, but I had definitely carried with me a piece of its soul. So, when it comes to the multiplicity of identities, our kids are actually a lot more adept and agile in navigating through the different pathways of different identities. For example, they have one home which they associate with their parents. They have another home which they can associate with their friends, another one with where they happen to be, and yet another one where they would rather aspire to be, and many more. And all their lives, they'll be putting pieces of these different places into a stained glass mosaic. Home for them is a work in progress. And such an emerging view of home is indeed a very liberating experience. Because when my parents were born, their sense of home and their sense of identity, even then their sense of who their enemies were pre-assigned to them at birth, and they could hardly step out of that. Whereas many of us are fortunate to be able to choose our home, create our communities, fashion ourselves, and in so we are able to step outside at least a little bit from the sharply defined black and white stereotyped images of our boundaries of our parents. And this ability to synthesize new identities is, of course, greatly aided and abetted by the interconnected world that we live in today, thanks to the internet. And the age of travel, which gives us this extraordinary mobility and movement, has of course played a big role in fostering newer and newer identities. Consider, for example, a young woman, half German, half Korean, living in the cosmopolitan city of London, where she meets a young man who is half Thai, half Canadian. And instantly she realizes that in this young man is a kindred spirit who has more in common with her than anybody entirely of Korea or entirely of Germany. So they become friends, and they fall in love, and they move to the most livable city in the world, Melbourne. And out of that union arises a little young girl who is neither Korean nor German, nor Thai, nor Canadian, nor Australian, but an evolving mix of all of this in a beautiful way. And hopefully this young woman would one day be dreaming about, thinking about, writing about her surroundings in a way which is totally different, an unprecedented blend of everything she has acquired genetically and environmentally. So, ladies and gentlemen, where is your home is not as important as, or where you come from is not quite so important as where you are going. Because more and more, most of us are rooted in the future than in the past. And in that sense, all of us are immigrants, not from one country to another, but from the present to the future. And therefore, I would say that home, as we know, is not so much where you happen to be born, but home is where you become yourself. Thank you.